Being late, I got peppered with questions in my earlier class because they have a term paper coming up and wanted to know all the rigorous formats I was going to enforce, even though I told them I didn't care about the format. But before we get going, let me pass out these again. I don't need them for a lot of today's lecture, but I do need them for one slide. Okay, I want to review one thing that we did last time and then move on. As I told you last time, this one will probably be on the shorter side of the lectures. What I had for binocular vision is a little too much for one lecture, but not really enough for two, so you'll get out early today. So remember we discussed at the end of class last time that the development of random dot stereograms by Ulege raised an interesting problem that nobody had thought before in the 1960s when he came up with this idea. And that is that one of the problems the visual system has to solve is to figure out which feature in the left eye matches up with which feature in the right eye. So if you think about how a stereogram is made, you have got a random noise patch that looks like this. You've got another one, identical patch over here. And what you do is you take a square of this one and you paste it over here, but shift it a little bit. And so here we have the square designated with A's and B's, the square designated with A's and B's here. But the part that you pulled out leaves a bunch of pixels that are only in this image and not in that one. Those are called unmatched points. So most of the points in here have a match between the two eyes, but there are a few of them along the edge that aren't matched. And we'll see shortly today that the unmatched points can have a big effect on our perception. Now, the solution to this problem was first proposed by a researcher at MIT named David Marr, who was really a major figure in computer vision, but unfortunately died in his early 30s. I think his impact would have been even greater had he had a normal career. And he came up with the first algorithm for solving this. And I went over this last time, so I'll go over it quickly this time. There are a couple of rules that work to get this algorithm to work. So the first idea is that neurons that are tuned to different depths in the same visual direction compete with each other. Compete is just another word for they mutually inhibit each other. And the other rule is this one here, that neurons turn to matches at the same depth in different visual directions. They excite each other. Right? So you got some sets of neurons that are inhibiting each other. You got some set of neurons that are exciting each other. And you let that go on for a while. This is typical neural network behavior. And some of the neurons will end up being active and other ones will be suppressed. And in this particular case, the ones that are being excited will pop out, and so this is the set of matches that the algorithm will generate. And this algorithm does a really good job at finding corresponding points. Now, the reason I mention that is that usually when we talk about stereo, we're considering about the points that match each other, right? So let's say I'm looking at your nose, it projects a position on one eye, it projects to a position on the other eye. And the difference between those two positions is what we refer to as binocular disparity. And it provides information about depth. However, the unmatched points can give us information as well. So I want you to look at this stereogram with the blue on the right, I believe. Oh, not this one, this one. Well, let me talk about it before you look at it. So here's the idea. Suppose you're looking at this square that's in front of a background back here. And let's say the square is colored yellow. And there's a region over here that's visible to the right eye, but it's not visible to the left. And similarly, there's a region over here that's visible to the left eye, but it's not visible to the right. And let's look how those unmatched regions can affect what's going on here. So before you put on your glasses, let me just talk about the stereogram. So notice that everything here is yellow. That means you're getting the same information through both eyes. You're getting both the red and the blue. And you've got a patch of green over here and a patch of red over here. Now I want you to look at this with the blue on the right and tell me what you see. I'll pick on my woman with the good stereo here. What do you see there?
It's like blue and red.
Do you see a gray oval somewhere?
No.
Anybody see a gray oval? You want blue on the right for this one. No gray ovals. Let me look at it back where you are.
Is it like on the outside, like the edge?
I'm sorry?
Is it the outside?
Yeah, it's the outside. So there's an oval that's behind the yellow circle. Can you see it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Anybody else see an oval that's behind the yellow circle? Should get out of your way. If you can see it, raise your hand. Oh, good number of you. All right, now the key thing I want you to notice here is that the information of that is not coming because of binocular disparity. It's coming from the mismatched points. The fact that you can see the green through one eye and not the other, and you can see the red through one eye and not the other. So it's the unmatched points are telling you that thing is in the background. So it's not just the corresponding points that are giving you information about 3D shape. The unmatched regions are also doing the same thing. Now this was discovered, believe it or not, by Leonardo da Vinci. And it's often referred to as Da Vinci stereo. The sort of knowledge of this got lost and it was rediscovered in the 1980s and was an exciting aspect of research for a while. But it goes way, way, way back. All right, so far what I've talked about is what causes disparity, what disparity could potentially tell you about the 3D world. And I want to spend the rest of the class today talking about what it actually tells us and some of the problems that arise in disparity. So just like motion, it's not universally applicable. There are some situations where binocular vision just doesn't work very well. But let me introduce you first to a problem. Remember, one of the definitions of disparity that I gave you before was the separation between corresponding points in the image plane. So if we look at this dot here, which has, so this dot, if we're fixating in on it, has zero disparity. The picture plane here is in the crossed region, And so when we can say that the dot here is uncrossed, but there's a separation between the corresponding points that this eye sees and this eye sees. Now, if we change the position of the dot, like so, so notice when the dot is in the image plane, the disparity goes to 0, and as it gets farther away, the disparity gets bigger. Now, if it crossed over and came in front, the disparity would get larger, but it would be negative disparity. We'd go from being uncrossed to crossed. So that's the thing here. This is the information that disparity is telling us. The bigger the disparity, the farther the depth. Any questions about this? So it's a simple rule. That's all you got to do is measure disparity, and that tells you about depth. Yeah.
Didn't you say early on in a lecture that our brains aren't actually calculating like the trigonometry of that distance?
Yes, I did, and I'm going to say it again in the rest of this lecture. So when I said the simple rule, more disparity, more depth, it actually isn't so simple. And the reason it's not so simple is because that's not the only thing that affects disparity. Disparity is also affected by viewing distance. So let's change the situation. Now the point is not moving relative to the observer. The point and the image plane are going to be fixed. But this time, it's the observer who's moving. All right, so the distance between the point and the image plane is constant. But as the observer moves back and forth, the disparity is changing. So let me give you a sense of how that works. So suppose that I'm looking at this row in the class right here. All right, and between you and you, there's a difference in binocular disparity that could tell me the difference in depth between where you two are sitting. But now if I look in the back of the row, there's another two students sitting the same distance apart. There's also a difference in disparity for them, but that difference in disparity is much smaller than the difference in disparity between you two. So it's not just the difference in disparity that's telling me about depth. You've also got to factor in how far are the things away from you, because that affects the pattern of disparity as well. This is referred to as the disparity scaling problem. The only way you can accurately compute depth from stereo is if you have some information to tell you how far away you are from the things that you're trying to judge. And I'll show you some examples of that as we go along. So here's an experiment on this, one of my favorite experiments. This is from Todd and Norman, 2003. And back in those days, computers were much more expensive than they are now. And when we did stereo displays, I had like a $20,000 workstation we were using. That was a replacement for the one that I bought when I first came to OSU, which cost almost $100,000. It was not nearly as powerful as your phone. Well, it's probably as powerful as your phone, but you know, your laptop could compete with it. So in this case, the stimuli were made out of the cardboard box that the computer shipped in. And the reason I wanted to do that is there was a lot of debate at the time of whether using computer displays for stereoscopic studies was potentially a bad thing, because you've got misinformation provided by the fact that there's no differences in accommodation between points at different distances. So here we use real objects. We did have a stereogram, but the stereogram was just the response device. So what subjects had to do is there are 3 pyramids on this box, and they each had a number. And on any display, a number would appear here, and the subjects would have, let's say, the number 3 appeared. What the subjects would have to do would be adjust the stereogram here to match the shape of the pyramid number 3 as labeled on the box. All right, so we ran this in 2 conditions. So let's suppose I'm doing this for you. I could put the box right here. Right, so you're judging it from about 3 feet away. And then you do a bunch of adjustments there. I'd send you home, bring you back in a week later. And now you run it where the box is here. What might you expect to get in this experiment? Any guesses? So what happens to disparity differences as things move farther away? They get smaller. And if I use disparity differences to judge depth, like how deep the pyramid is, that might suggest that you'd see taller pyramids when they're closer, or pyramids extended in depth more when they're closer than when they're far apart. That's one possible result. Another possible result is that, well, I have some good sense of how far away this is. I could take that into account, and that would give me shape constancy as I look at the box from different distances. So, for example, you might intuitively think that's what happens, right? Because the size of my nose doesn't appear to change as I walk toward you. Or does it? You're not necessarily attending to the size of my nose. So let's see what the results of that are. So here's the setup. You can tell this is before digital photography got any good. So this is the stereogram in the monitor. This is the cardboard at a very near distance, so the subject's sitting about right here. And you see the numbers on the different pyramids. And here's what the data look like. So the black bars are the far pyramids. The blue bars are the near pyramids. This is the judged depth of the pyramid. Accurate response is always going to be 1. So what it really is how much is the depth they judged relative to the actual depth of the pyramid. So correct response here would be 1. So what do you see? Every single subject, a possible exception to this one, saw the pyramids as being flatter in the far condition than in the near condition. So they're seeing less depth when the pyramids are this far away and more depth when they're close to where you're viewing it from. Now, the other thing you should note here is that there are a lot of individual differences, and this is pretty common in this line of research. It's like when we talked about the observer share in shape from shading. Subjects have to make something up. They got to resolve this stereoscaling problem somehow, and different observers seem to do it in different ways. On average, the difference is about 20%. So if you go from the pyramids that are 1 meter away to, say, 3 or 4 meters away, you get a reduction in depth of about 20%. Any questions on this before I move on? Now, what does this tell us? What it tells us is that, yeah, we're using binocular disparity differences to judge the extent of these pyramids in depth, but we don't have a good way of scaling those, right? It's that scaling with distance that we don't really know how to do. And what that causes is we make systematic errors, that as things get farther away in depth, they appear to become less extended in depth. Let's do an experiment on the class. You all drive, yes? You've all driven on the highway, and they have passing lanes on the highway. And how are those passing lanes on the highway, how are they structured? Are they continuous lines or are they dashed? Okay, let's do a survey in the class. How many of you think those dashes are 1 foot long? Raise your hand. How many of you think the dashes are 20 feet long? Raise your hand. How many of you think way down? All right, how long do you think the dashes are?
9 feet.
9 feet. How long do you think they are?
Say 6.
Any other guesses?
10.
Any other guesses? How long do you think the lines on the road are? You should do this experiment when you're out driving. Typically don't do it while you're driving. Do you have any guesses on how long those lines are?
I feel like 4 or 5.
4 or 5? How about you?
I feel like 6.
You think 6? Anybody less than 6? How long do you think they are? 3? How many do you think they are?
1 meter, I don't know.
1 meter is 3 feet. Yours actually is the most common answer. Any idea how long they actually are? They're like 16 feet. All right, here's how to do the experiment. Do it when you're a passenger. All right? So in one case, look out the front of the car down the road, and you'll see what she said. But then, after you do that, look out the side of the car as you're passing by the dashed lines, and you'll see they're as long as your car. Trust me, that's true.
I believe you.
And the reason why that is as they get farther away, well, you got two things going on. A, they're being compressed because you're seeing them at a smaller visual angle. But whatever stereo information you're using, that's getting compressed as well. So there are all kinds of things telling you that those things are compressed. Now, when I first started writing about this, these effects are really old. I mean, they go back, I think the first experiment that studied not dashed lines on the highway, but intervals in depth at different distances goes back to the beginning of the 19th century. Obviously, they couldn't do dashed lines on the highway then because they didn't have highways with dashed lines. But this stuff came back into vogue in the 1990s, and it was very controversial. There were a lot of people who said, no, that can't happen. Right? We have to see it correctly. It's ridiculous that we'd see it otherwise. So this is an experiment that I did with several of my students at that time in 1996. And again, we wanted to deal with real objects here. This is another one of my favorite experiments where we built this device. These are a bunch of little LEDs. And there's a monitor at the end here. So the subject sits over here, and a pair of LEDs comes on, and the subject has to adjust a line in the monitor to match the distance between the two LEDs. And the surface that it's on is a sheet that I bought at Burlington Coat Factory on sale for $5. As you can see from the nature of this sheet, no one would want to put this on an actual bed, but it was perfect for the purposes of this experiment because we want to give a lot of rich information about for stereo to lock in on. All right, so simple study. Each trial, a pair of LEDs comes on, and subject has to match the length on the monitor using an adjustment, using a little knob. And here's what the data look like. Oh, this is the configuration of the pairs of dots. So some dots are in the same depth, other dots are at different depths, and they're adjusting both of these things. There are a couple of purposes to this experiment. I'm not going to tell you about the more complicated one, just the simpler one. And notice, so the observer's here, and you have some pairs that are near, and you have an identical pair here that's farther away. All right, and similarly, you have a horizontal pair here and an identical pair over here that's farther away. So all of these pairs have matched counterparts at different distances. And let's see how that affects their judgments. So here we have 6 observers. This is me here. This is very atypical. I appear to be one of the noisier observers in this experiment. But notice what's going on. So if we look at the open circles, the open circles are the LEDs that are aligned in depth like this. And so those, as you get farther away, the judged distance between them gets smaller. This is the effect of the dashed lines on the highway. So as they get farther away, the judged distance gets smaller. And as you see in this case, if we go from 60 to 150 centimeters, I believe, yeah, centimeters, it's dropping by close to 20%. And all observers show the effect. Now the interesting thing is that when we look at the dots that are aligned at the same depth, these dots, right, so you're going to judge it like so, and then you judge it again like so. Notice in this case, as the dots get farther away, the judged distance between them goes up. Not by a huge amount, but every subject shows the effect. Both of these findings have been reported many times in the literature, and we certainly were not the first to do this. We were the first to do it on a flowered sheet with LEDs, though. So again, it's telling us the same thing. I have no idea how to explain this thing. One common explanation is a sort of explanation I don't really like, is that when you see these at different distance, right? So if you look at it here, and then I move it away, it has a smaller optical projection because of perspective, and you compensate for that and make it bigger than what it really appears, and that's what's responsible for this effect. This one, the most likely explanation is that it's the fact that as you get farther away, the disparity difference between the LEDs goes down, and if you're using disparity differences as a source of information about the distance between the two LEDs, then that would predict as things get farther away, they should appear to be smaller. Any questions on this before I move on? That brings us to another one of my favorite studies. This is a group that we've talked about many times. Jan Kunderink, you've heard about before. This is a picture of him. That's his wife, Ans van Doorn. That's his assistant, Astrid Koppers. That's the person who runs the mechanics and technology group in the physics department over there. His name's Hans Kolonis, and that's a much younger version of me. Much younger and lighter version of me. Have any of you been to the Netherlands before? Do you notice anything weird about this picture?
No bikes.
I'm sorry?
No bikes.
That's a good answer. Anything else weird about the figure?
It's sunny. It's sunny.
It's sunny. It's never sunny in the Netherlands. It rains all the time. Had one of my neighbors was just over in Belgium for 10 days. It rained every day. He was really pissed off. I was there for 3 weeks once, and it rained every day. So this is a dicey experiment. So the way these are done is I fly over for a week. So we used to do this as a home and away. Like I would go to the Netherlands and we'd do an experiment there. And then either another trip the same year or the next year, Astrid and Jan would come over and stay with me, and we'd do an experiment at Ohio State. And so this was the Netherlands end of the trip. And the experiment could only be done outside, so we were completely at the mercy of the weather. So if it had rained like it usually does, we would have been screwed. But it didn't. We had nice weather. So here's the idea. I've shown you this slide before. Subjects had a bunch of poles, and they could adjust this remote control vehicle here. And what they were told to do is so 2 of the poles would be designated, and the subjects had to adjust so that this thing bisects those 2. So just to see how that works, let's need a volunteer. You want to volunteer?
Sure.
Come on up.
Okay.
It'll be the easiest task a professor ever asked you to do. I want you to draw a dot that bisects those 2.
So draw a dot in the middle.
Draw a dot in the middle. Pretty easy, right?
Yeah.
That's enough. That's all I wanted you to do.
Cool. Okay.
All right? So that's what the subject had to do, only they're doing it now not on the board but in 3D. So I might say, all right, you do it. I want you to tell me whether to position that, well, no, let's have you do it. Okay? I want you to tell me when the laser pointer is exactly halfway between these 2 young ladies. Tell me which way I need to move it.
That way.
Toward the front?
Yeah. Stop.
Stop right here?
Yeah.
All right, come up and look where you put it. Notice you put it closer to her than her?
Yeah.
That's typical response. So we make, that's the kind of mistake that people make when we do this. They also make other mistakes. They don't put it on the same line. I should tell a little more about the methodology. So what the subject does is adjust this thing until it looks like it's bisecting those 2 poles. And then we have to measure the placement somehow. So the one of the experimenters, in this case me, runs over and puts a mirror on the top of the pole. This is the least precise aspect of the experiment. And then Jan has a $10,000 laser rangefinder that he shines on the mirror and can measure its position with like sub-millimeter accuracy. But then you have to ask yourself, can this researcher position the mirror with sub-millimeter accuracy? Probably not, but close enough for our purposes. And here's what the results look like. Very interesting. So this is the actual configuration. And these are the bisection judgments, and these things are called error ellipses. So the subject's over here, and notice that most of the error is in depth. The subjects in the frontal parallel plane are not getting very much variance. The error is always their adjustment in depth. That's what they're least certain about. And a couple of things to note. A, the lines that they designate are not straight lines. So if they were truly bisecting this thing, they'd put it on the red line, but they never do. It's always curved. Again, this is a very old result that I think was first reported in the 19th century. And the other thing is that they don't bisect the differences. So the interval that's farther away from you, the subject's adjusted so that the far interval is larger than the near interval. Again, which is a classic result. So the farther things are away, the smaller the intervals appear, and the subjects compensate that by making them larger relative to the near intervals. So these are the kinds of distortions you see. Now the other thing to note here is that this isn't in some darkened laboratory with minimal conditions. We're in an open field, for Christ's sake. This is about as natural a viewing situation as you can have. Many of the early studies on this used, the subjects were in complete darkness and they'd have these isolated lights that were showing, and they were the first ones to show these effects, but that's certainly not a necessary condition to make that happen. So the moral of the story here is that, as you pointed out earlier in the class, are you a leprechaun today?
Mario and Luigi?
Oh, Luigi.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're getting outside of my cultural awareness zone. And what is the reason for being Luigi today?
Halloween.
All right, I guess that's a good reason. All right, well, that's an aside. So the moral of the story here is that, again, in all these different sources of information that I've been talking about throughout the last two sections of the course, the information that we have available is not perfect. And because the information we have available is not perfect, that causes us to make systematic errors in our judgments. Now, depending on the information, our errors when we do structure from motion, or shape for shading, or shape from texture, or shape from binocular vision, they're all a little bit different from one another because the nature of the ambiguous information is a little bit different. But in each case, we get predictable patterns of distortion when we measure subjects' behavior that are consistent with the underlying theory. Now, what makes this so controversial? Might as well get right down to the nub of it. And there are a lot of people out there in perception who really hate this result, or these results, even though there are hundreds of studies that show these effects, done by many, many laboratories over a span of more than 100 years. But the reason people bristle is they say, look, when I walk around the world, things don't look like they're distorting. They look constant. And I don't have a ready answer for why that is the case. I mean, one possibility is maybe the kind of metric structure that we're getting at when we measure these effects is not the primary basis of our behavior, of our perception. So what we're really seeing is more affine, topological kinds of properties, and metric things are an afterthought. That's one possibility. Another possibility is, well, they really do tend to distort, but we don't generally attend to them because those distortions are not really meaningful for us as behaviors in the natural environment. So whatever reason, when you do systematic studies and you have subjects rate, what are these distance intervals, they show big errors. But they don't actually notice this. We'll talk about another experiment later on in the course when we do perception, the guide of action, that there are certain occasions, I'll save this for later, but let's suppose you hold out your hand. Yeah, hold out your hand. And do I want to do this in this crowded environment? All right, I'm not going to do it for real. But let's say we put a bag over my head, and my job then is to walk to where your hand is, we can do that with remarkable accuracy. But if I ask you to bisect the distance between, you can pull it back in now, bisect the distance between me and your hand, I show systematic errors when I do that. Now, one of the reasons for that is that bisection tasks require knowledge of affine structure. Just knowing where your hand is doesn't. I'll talk more about this later, but there's some seemingly conflicting results that we'll deal with when it comes to motor actions. One question I used to get when I would give colloquia on this kind of stuff would be, well, if that's true, how come Michael Jackson hits 75%, I'm sorry, Michael Jordan hits 75% of his jumpers? I don't think Michael Jackson could hit 75% of his jumpers. I can tell a crude joke, but I won't. And so my response to all that was, yeah, but he can't hit a curveball. Yeah, Michael Jackson. Why am I doing this? Michael Jordan quit basketball for a number of years, and he decided he was going to pro baseball and couldn't make it because he couldn't hit a curveball. But all right, moving right along. This class is degenerating quickly. All right, now there's another theme in this course that I want to come back to again, and that is that all of these sources of information we deal with are to a large extent context dependent. So there's a lecture that we had earlier where I talked about different kinds of contours. Remember, we brought that out when we were doing structure for motion, and I said that the models of structure for motion work with some kinds of contours, but they don't work with others. And guess what? Binocular disparity is exactly the same thing. Binocular disparity and structure for motion are really similar. It's like in one case, right, you're looking at an object rotate in depth, and in the other case, the observer is rotating depth sort of with the two eyes that are looking at different angles. So the underlying information is mathematically very, very similar. And there are lots of similarities between structure for motion and shape from binocular disparity. And one of those similarities is that they are dependent on particular kinds of contours. So as you recall, we have reflectance contours, illumination contours, orientation contours. I think in the earlier lecture I called them corners. Smooth occlusions, specular highlights and reflections. And here are examples of those. So we have a reflectance contour, a shadow, it's an illumination contour, concave corner, smooth occlusion, edge occlusion, specular highlight. And so these are the different kinds of contours. Now the reason I bring this up is stereo likes reflectance contours and corners. So concave corners, edge occlusions, convex corners. It likes corners and it likes reflectance contours. It doesn't like smooth occlusions. It despises specular highlights. And not so crazy about shadows. Does it deal with? Yeah, it does okay with shadows. So let's look at some examples of this. So consider smooth occlusion. So this eye is looking at the surface, and there's an occlusion point right here. This eye looks at the surface, and the occlusion point is right there. So if the brain were trying to fuse those two occlusion points, it would conclude that this point is not on the surface, it's hanging off the surface like so. Specular highlights are even worse. So let's say I have a light, and this is a shiny surface. So the light hits here, and you get a specular highlight at that point in this eye. And same light hits here, and you get a specular highlight in that eye. The reason why this happens is the specular highlight is always, so this angle and that angle are the same in terms of specular highlights. So depending on the angle that the light's shining on the surface, the highlight will be located in a different place for the human eye. So we were curious in an experiment, just like the motion one I told you about earlier. We looked at stereo, I don't think this is in stereo. No, those aren't stereograms. We looked at textured objects. So these are ideal for stereo because you have those texture features that stereo can lock onto. You also have smooth occlusion contours, which are bad for stereo. Here we have specular highlights, which are also bad for stereo. And this one, the projector is not adjusted right, but this one is presumably diffuse shading, which is not so bad for stereo. So stereo should be okay here, it should be okay here, and it should be terrible here. That's the prediction. So we had subjects judge the shapes of these things in a number of conditions, and here's what we get. So again, the prediction is you should be pretty good with the textured objects, pretty good with the matte objects, not very good with the shiny objects, based on what we know about corresponding features in binocular vision. And so here are the results. These are R-squares between sessions. So the black lines are test-retest reliability. What that means is subjects, whatever shape they judge, they do it very reliably. You bring them in one day, you bring them in another day, they do almost exactly the same judgments. This is comparing different directions of illumination. Has a little bit of effect on the matte surfaces, not so much for the specular ones. This is how closely the subject's judgments are with the simulated object. Notice here they're down. The subjects are very reliable, but it's not a very good match necessarily to the actual object. They're making systematic mistakes. And then this is the R-square between observers is the lowest of all. What this is telling us is that different observers are making errors in different ways. But the main thing to keep in mind here is that they're showing pretty much the same pattern in all three of these conditions. So somehow the observers are able to deal with the specular highlights. Not clear how they can do it, but they can. Since this time, there have been a bunch of experiments on this topic. And again, the results are a mixed bag. That there's some situations where you can see shape from pure specularities, and there are others where the surface is just wildly distorted. And it's not completely clear what distinguishes those situations from each other. But the main point I want to make from you is that specularities and smooth occlusion contours, you can't analyze the same way as you do corners or texture because they don't behave optically the same way. And so if you analyze those using a standard shape from stereo algorithm, you'll get the wrong answer. And as I promised, I will let you out early today. And I guess it wasn't that early. And remember, our next exam is Tuesday. I will be around if you have questions for me. I know some of you have already made appointments to see me. If anybody else needs to talk to me, I'll be happy to schedule something either Friday or Monday. Yes, please bring back the glasses.